What's going on, everyone? Welcome back. Today we have got our Week 13 fantasy running back starts and sits for every single matchup. So make sure to tune in if you guys enjoy. Hit that like button, subscribe. Also, give us a follow on Twitter at AllDayPigskin to continue interacting with us, shooting us your questions there. We'll make sure to answer them. And also, check us out online at alldaypigskin.com. Sign up for a free newsletter to get access to exclusive content. All those details in the description. But for now, let's get right into it. Before getting into our breakdowns, I want to give you guys a quick word from our sponsors at Overlay Fantasy Sports, who are taking DFS to a whole nother level. And I specifically want to highlight their matchup shop function, which is an absolute blast. In fact, we've been using it since the start of the NFL season because, let's face it, betting on the same old Team A versus Team B can get a little bit stale, a little bit boring. Well, that's not even close to being the case with the matchup shop of Overlay Fantasy, as it allows you to bet on individual player matchups, and it's super simple. Just pick whichever player you think will have the higher fantasy performance. And just like a regular bet would work, check out the spreads, do your research, and then win some money. You can bet on pretty much any single sport that you want, whether it's NFL, golf, MLB, etc. All those options are there. And again, super simple. Pretty much for any single NFL game coming up, you've got a bunch of different matchups that are always updated and added to. So if it's something as simple as just putting a single submission, you can do that. But guess what? If you want to get a parlay going and double up some of those winnings, you can do that as well. So take advantage of this. All of that homework you're doing for your fantasy lineups, let's have that translate to some big time winnings for your wallet as well. So do yourself a favor and check out Overlay Fantasy's matchup shop now. Our first game of the week, we have got the Cincinnati Bengals at the Miami Dolphins. And when looking at running backs to start, we mainly want to focus on the Miami side of things here, specifically Myles Gaskin and Salvon Ahmed. And the reason we say that is because they have the much better situation. They actually have a viable offense with a viable quarterback, regardless whether it's Tua or Fitzpatrick. The Bengals can't really say the same thing. As a result, you see either Gaskin or Ahmed as possible starts. Now, obviously, this would depend on if they both return from injury. And if they don't, I would probably fade the Miami backfield then, because it turns more into a running back by committee. That's very tough to predict. But in the situation that Gaskin plays, you fire him up in full confidence. This is a great matchup versus the Bengals defense. Same situation with Ahmed. If it's just one of these two guys, I view that choice as a high-end RB2. While for the Bengals, it's a tough situation, but we actually have Giovanni Bernard as a sit. In terms of difficulty versus this Dolphins defense, I imagine it'll be a situation similar to what the Bengals faced versus the Giants this last week. And unfortunately, with no Joe Burrow, this entire Bengals offense takes a big hit, including the rushing attack. Bernard not being used as much, pass catching and rushing, so his ceiling really goes down. The floor not as high as we would like. I would say if you guys are desperate in specifically PPR formats because of what Bernard, can do as a pass catcher, then maybe you take a chance on him, but he is very, very touchdown dependent. The usage not what we would like to see judging on last week. So for that reason, I would say at best case scenario, he is in the RB3 category. Then we've got the Raiders at the Jets, and this is a situation you definitely want to monitor. Josh Jacobs tweaks that ankle last week. There's a chance that he goes versus the Jets, and if he does, great, you fire him up. He is a great option. If he doesn't, though, this could open the door for Devontae Booker and more playing time for him as the season progresses, which obviously as a Josh Jacobs owner, you don't want. But if Booker is available on the waivers, definitely go ahead, pick him up, because he could be a great option if Jacobs misses this game versus this awful Jets squad, and even more so if Jacobs misses more time in weeks ahead. Either way, whether it's Jacobs or Booker, I would again say RB2 upside, high-end RB2 at that. And then as crazy as it might sound, for the Jets, I'll actually start Frank Gore. More so in standard scoring formats, that's where his upside is. Not going to do much as a pass catcher, but this Raiders defense got just gashed by the Falcons this last week in the rushing department, and Frank Gore will get the usage. I think you can probably expect a stat line of between 15 to 20 carries for right around 80 to 90 yards, which isn't all that bad, putting him in the low-end RB2 category. Moving on, we've got the Colts at the Texans. And again, this is a tough situation. You see a lot of asterisks here, but let us explain. For the Colts, if Jonathan Taylor plays, then you obviously start him. It was a situation where he missed last week due to COVID IR concerns. But if he's available, you fire him up versus this awful Texans rush defense. But if he isn't, then Nyheim Hines is the guy that you want to focus in on. He was the guy that got the most opportunities. Now, whether that translates into red zone touches, that's not necessarily 100% certain, but either way, he is the guy combined with his passing work and his rushing upside that you want to own if Jonathan Taylor is not starting for the Colts. Then for the Texans, you see David Johnson and Duke Johnson. Now, David Johnson could potentially return from IR from his concussion. If he does, I would play him. Obviously not the best of matchups, but this is more so focused on the side of pass catching abilities with the news of the Will Fuller suspension. And I'm looking in Johnson, both Johnsons actually, as upside PPR plays. Now, if David Johnson doesn't suit up here, then I think Duke Johnson is a fine play, especially in PPR scoring, as a low-end RB2. That's how I would treat David Johnson as well. And then obviously knock down Duke Johnson a couple of spots. But we really need to see in this first game without Will Fuller what this offense looks like for the Texans, because I anticipate they're going to use their running backs as pass catchers, definitely more so, unless, they add that type of big name wide receiver. So for that reason, that's the situation we find ourselves with the Texans running backs. Next up, we've got the Browns at the Titans. This is extremely simple. Nick Chubb, Kareem Hunt for the Browns. You start him. Chubb is a very solid standard RB1 play, especially versus this Titans defense. Kareem Hunt, again, definitely a PPR-based play in that low-end RB2 category. While for the Titans, Derrick Henry, you fire him up. His schedule is finally getting nicer, and this is where it will pay off. The guy is an RB1 pretty much for the remainder of the season. He could be the number one running back, honestly, to round out the season every single week. Afterwards, Lions at the Bears. And if DeAndre Swift finally comes back, then we anticipate, even versus this tough Bears matchup, which it definitely is, that he will get a good amount of volume, which will put him in the RB2 category. But if he doesn't, then Adrian Peterson has actually had historical success versus the Bears. And I would view him as a Frank Gore type of guy this week. Probably 15 to 17 carries for 60 to 80 yards. I think, again, especially in standard scoring, you could do worse. Then for the Bears, David Montgomery, as bad as this Bears offense is, we said it to kick off the season, they actually show up versus the Lions. And with the Lions being so bad, especially defensively, I anticipate David Montgomery will have a good opportunity here. And this is a situation where the schedule gets really nice for David Montgomery. Now, obviously, that's not guaranteeing anything, but the situation is it's nice upside, and if the Bears are smart enough to hand off the ball to Montgomery consistently, then he is in the high-end RB2 conversation. And then for the Lions, you see Kerryon Johnson as a sit. This is more so if Swift and Adrian Peterson obviously both play, then Johnson the odd man out. Afterwards, Jaguars at the Vikings. Super simple. You start James Robinson and you start Dalvin Cook. It's as simple as it gets. Both have RB1 upside on the week. Then Saints at the Falcons. I'll start Alvin Kamara and I'll start Latavius Murray. Both these guys are a little bit in altered roles with no Drew Brees. Probably a little bit more concerned for Alvin Kamara just because of the different type of usage he's getting in terms of a rusher and in terms of a pass catcher. But you continue to fire him up, especially in PPR leagues. Maybe He's a low-end RB1, but this is a good matchup versus the Falcons. I would go ahead and still play him. And then look for Latavius Murray. These last 2 weeks, the usage, especially as a rusher, has been very nice to see, encouraging, especially in terms of volume. In terms of standard scoring formats, I would take a chance on him in that, low to mid-level RB2 range. And for the Falcons, I don't have faith in Todd Gurley or Brian Hill versus the Saints defense. They got absolutely shut down a couple of weeks ago, and I anticipate a similar type of situation. I am fading both those rushers for the Falcons. Afterwards, Rams at the Cardinals. For the Cardinals, mainly Kenyon Drake and Chase Edmonds. Drake is the guy that has the higher ceiling, while Chase Edmonds is more so a dart throw in PPR scoring because, those 3 to 4 catches a game, combine that with maybe 20 yards receiving and then 30 yards rushing, that'll add up to right around, 9-10 points on the week, putting him in that RB3 category. While for the Rams, we've got all those rushers as sits. It's just a full-on running back by committee. Yes, Cam Akers kind of had that big week in week 12, so maybe he's trending upwards. As things stand right now, this is how we would rank the guys as we have listed: Henderson, Akers, and then Malcolm Brown. But in overall fashion, they're all healthy, so it's tough to predict. For that reason, we're staying away from this backfield. Afterwards, Giants at the Seahawks. The best start here is Chris Carson. Returned from injury this last week, and he finally looked decent. Now, I anticipate the usage will only continue to go up, and I would definitely take a chance versus the Giants. Their defense has improved, but definitely the best running back option here. Then for the Giants, tough. But if Devonta Freeman comes back, then I would say all the running backs are sits because Wayne Gallman has played very well in the time that Devonta Freeman has missed. So I do think he's earned more playing time. But it's a situation where if that's the case, then again, they will vulture each other. So neither one really great plays here versus the Seahawks rush defense. If Freeman does sit, then Gallman I would, however, have as a start in the low-end RB2 conversation. Afterwards, Patriots at the Chargers. I'll continue to start Damian Harris and James White for Harris. It's a situation of when Sony Michel finally gets the usage, then you go ahead and you knock him down a couple of spots. But as far as, again, standard scoring is concerned, especially with the little amount of passing that Cam Newton is doing, Harris not a bad play in that low-end RB2 conversation. Same with James White in PPR scoring, low-end RB2, high-end RB3 in terms of how he's being used as a pass catcher. Then for the Chargers, very simple. Austin Eckler is finally back. He looked sensational last week. Continue to fire him up regardless of the matchups. In PPR scoring, he is in the RB1 conversation. Then Eagles at the Packers. I will start Miles Sanders and Aaron Jones. Relatively simple here. Miles Sanders coming off a tough game versus Seattle, but this Packers defense very friendly versus the rush. He is the top running back here. I expect a bounce back game. Then for the Packers, Aaron Jones. He is still the main rusher, and I think this is a bit of a better matchup versus the Eagles compared to versus the Bears last week. So I like Aaron Jones. And then I have got the handcuffs both as sits. I think this will be a big Miles Sanders game, so I'm fading Boston Scott. And then same for Jamal Williams. But obviously both worth owning in terms of top handcuffs. However, just in terms of the way we see this matchup playing out, it's a situation where we think they're both better off suited as sits. Afterwards, Broncos at the Chiefs. This is a situation where we anticipate Philip Lindsay might miss some time. So Melvin Gordon returns into your start category for this week. Potentially for weeks ahead, I would have him as a mid-level RB2. For the Chiefs, Clyde Edwards-Helaire, better matchup, much more so compared to the Bucs last week. I think he is probably in the mid RB2 conversation as well. And then those backups, Royce Freeman, yes, his usage might be trending up, but I still think it's Melvin Gordon. There's a much bigger gap between Gordon and Freeman than Gordon and Lindsay. And then Le'Veon Bell for the Chiefs as a sit. I think, again, Clyde Edwards-Helaire is still the preferred option, and Le'Veon Bell is someone that I would be fading. Then Washington at the Steelers. For Washington, Antonio Gibson, J.D. McKissic, you kind of have to start them, especially Gibson in terms of the way his usage is trending. I would put him, however, due to the very tough matchup here, in the mid to low end RB2 category. For McKissic, now again, his arrow is pointing down because of how much work Gibson is getting, but I think in this specific matchup, McKissic might actually get a good amount of receiving work yet again. So in PPR scoring, I would put him in the high-end RB3, low-end RB2 category. Then for the Steelers, this one is really tough to predict because by now we'd usually have, the previous week wrapped up. That's not the case for the Steelers or the Ravens. James Conner, he was potentially dealing with COVID issues. Knowing his history, he might miss some extra time or be a little bit more careful. So I anticipate he probably doesn't play in this matchup. So if he somehow does, though, I would still have him as a sit versus this tough Washington defense. Same for Benny Snell. He would be the presumed lead back in that situation. But again, I think this is a tough situation and a Steelers offense that's been struggling to rush the football versus this Washington front. No, thank you. Then we go to the Bills at the 49ers. Only running back that I can start here with confidence is Raheem Mostert. He had success in terms of getting a touchdown this last week. I think his usage will only continue to go up. He is the preferred choice offensively for the 49ers in the rushing department. Then as far as sits, Singletary and Zach Moss, yes, they both had decent outings this last week, but the 49ers defense, it has the pieces to slow you down. And with Singletary and Moss both playing so well, they're again vulturing each other. It's a full-on running back by committee, almost 50-50 split. And then with Josh Allen getting the true red zone opportunities, I'm fading both these guys here. And then Jeff Wilson for the 49ers. Yes, he had a decent outing, decent usage this last week. But again, I anticipate Mostert's arrow and usage to continue going up. So for that reason, Wilson is probably a fade. Afterwards, Cowboys at the Ravens. So for the Cowboys, I'll start Ezekiel Elliott on paper. Probably, someone that you might consider sitting versus the Ravens. But the Ravens being so hard hit by COVID. And honestly, I don't even know if this game takes place, even though it's a week in the future. But if it somehow does, I just think that there's going to be so much precipitation in terms of the Ravens and how they feel those after effects of COVID and missing pieces offensively, defensively. It's an absolute mess that Ezekiel Elliott might actually have a good outing. And then for Baltimore starts Gus Edwards. If he somehow doesn't end up on the COVID list, then whoever is the main running back here, you start versus the Cowboys. That's the point we're trying to make. Now, obviously, you see Mark Ingram and J.K. Dobbins as sits. That's assuming that they are not eligible to play because they're still dealing with COVID IR situations. But again, this is a situation that you honestly just have to monitor in terms of who shows up as the primary rusher for the Ravens and then just kind of go with them. But I would say for now, Ezekiel Elliott is the preferred option in probably an RB2 range on the week. So with that, we wrap up our Week 13 fantasy running back starts and sits. And as always, let us hear it in the comment section. Did you agree, disagree, along with any other start or sit questions you guys might have? We'll do our best to answer them. And in the meantime, if you enjoyed, hit that like button, subscribe. Also, give us a follow on Twitter at AllDayPigskin to continue interacting with us, sending us your questions there. We'll make sure to answer them as well. And finally, check us out online at alldaypigskin.com. Sign up for our free newsletter to get access to exclusive content. All those details in the description. But for now, we'll see you guys in future videos.